Hello tankers! In this guide I will explain working principles, advantages and disadvantages of all shell types that can currently be found in the game. All these shells I could separate into four main categories: armor piercing high explosive, armor piercing subcaliber, and chemical energy shells. See the timestamps in the description. Armor-piercing shells are the most basic shell type. The penetration effect is very simple. Shell penetrates armor, creating some spalling that slightly deviates from the shell's path and then travels inside the tank. Shell creates more spalling after it hits internal modules if it still has enough kinetic energy left. There are four different types of AP shells in the game. Armor piercing, a solid round. Armor piercing capped, solid round with additional softer metal cap that increases penetration on sloped armor but decreases aerodynamics. Armor piercing ballistic capped, makes projectile more aerodynamic, decreasing loss of kinetic energy over distance. And the best of them all, armor piercing capped, ballistic capped, combining both penetration on sloped armor and aerodynamic improvements. Quantity of spalling depends on shell size and thickness of armor penetrated. Low tier tank shells weighing up to 1 kg create minimum spalling and hardly can kill a crew member, so direct hit with a projectile is required. While higher tier tanks shooting projectiles of 20 or more kilograms create a huge cloud of additional metal pieces that can reliably knock out the crew member that is not located directly on shell's path. You will encounter these projectiles from tier 1 to tier 6, but most likely will be using different, more effective type of ammo as soon as you unlock such option. Armor piercing high explosive, probably the most deadly shell type in the game. Despite having slightly less penetration than solid AP shells, it has a dirty gift inside that fully compensates that. Upon penetrating armor, which creates spalling, a delayed fuse activates that destroys projectile inside enemy's tank, sending a sphere of projectiles fragments in all directions. It also has four variations: armor piercing high explosive, armor piercing high explosive capped, more penetration on sloped armor, armor piercing high explosive ballistic capped to decrease air resistance, and armor piercing high explosive capped ballistic capped, the combined effect of both caps. It's important to notice three things about this type of ammunition. For activating delayed fuse, shell is required to pass a minimum thickness of armor shown in shell's information tab as fuse sensitivity. If projectile pierces less ammo, for example when shooting trucks, it will not explode and will only create some spalling. Another important information is fuse delay. It shows you where, after penetrating minimum armor thickness, shot will explode. Some of the projectiles detonate early and some can travel over a meter inside the middle of a crew compartment to create maximum damage in all directions. Last thing is explosive mass. As different explosive types are used in different shells, we can get general idea by comparing TNT equivalent. Obviously, more explosive better for you and worse for enemy. Anything more than 100 grams will most likely lead to one shot. For the sake of completeness, I'd like to mention shrapnel shells, which act very much like APHE shells but have small penetration and should be replaced by APHE as soon as you can. Armor-piercing subcaliber shells use full advantage of huge load of explosives that can fit in big diameter gun and focuses all its energy on smaller diameter projectile. This type of ammunition has very high penetration, but because of smaller projectile mass, does not create much spalling, and must be shot at exact place where enemy crew member is. There are three types of subcaliber shells: armor-piercing composite rigid, armor-piercing discarding sabot, and armor-piercing discarding sabot fin stabilized. Let's take a closer look at each of them. Composite rigid, sometimes called high-velocity armor-piercing, consists of high-density core surrounded by a shell of lighter metal. Because projectile becomes lighter, higher velocities are achieved, leading to more penetration. Upon penetration, only smaller, dense metal core gets inside. Has poor aerodynamics, so quickly loses speed over distance. Armor-piercing discarding sabot is a lot like APCR, just the light casing is discarded as soon as shell leaves the barrel and only dense core flies towards the target. This way, less air resistance is achieved, making it more effective over longer ranges. Armor-piercing discarding sabot fin stabilized is modern projectile widely used until these days. Compared to older discarding sabot, this type of projectile is stabilized by fins and is much longer compared to diameter. This lets the shell to concentrate even more kinetic energy on a small area when penetrating armor. These three projectiles has two characteristics in common. Muzzle velocity is higher, especially of most modern apdsfs shells, making it easier to aim at moving targets over longer distance, as you don't need to compensate that much for gravity and leading the target. And ricochets start happening at much bigger slopes. If full caliber shells start to have a chance of ricochet at about 47-48 degrees, subcaliber composite rigid shells will not do that until angle is bigger than 66 degrees, and discarding sabot projectiles do not ricochet until they hit armor at more than 75 degrees. Chemical energy shells, unlike all listed before, do not depend on kinetic energy when penetrating armor, so do not lose penetration over distance. Instead, they use explosives in a different ways. Because they all explode upon contact with fuse sensitivity less than a millimeter, you cannot shoot them through buildings or trees. There are three types of chemical energy shells: a high explosive squash head, and two high explosive anti-tank variants. Let's have a closer look at them. Common high explosive shell has very simple principle. Upon contact, explosives inside detonate, sending shell's fragments in a sphere around the explosion. Very effective against targets with little to no armor. Large enough projectile can damage soft targets without direct hit by sending deadly fragments few meters away. This way it's possible to damage or even kill a vehicle hiding around the corner. It is also possible to use this type of ammunition against heavy armor if the shell's caliber is big enough. Even then, only the weakest armor plates of roof and bottom can be penetrated. Detonating near the roof can be achieved by shooting cupolas or machine guns, and penetration from the bottom by shooting directly below the enemy. High explosive squash head are designed to be more effective on thicker armor. Just like name suggests, upon contact, head shell deforms, sticking to the outside armor, and after detonation, shockwave travels through the armor, knocking metal in another side and sending spall at high speed inside the tank. Despite penetrating more than HE shell, it's still not reliable against heavy armor unless very big calibers used. High explosive anti-tank, also known as shaped charge, has very unique way of penetrating armor. The shell consists of copper cone surrounded by explosives in a such way that after detonation, cone is shaped into a jet that is directed forward at hypersonic speed. Explosion itself can damage soft targets or external modules, but because stream is quite small, the effect inside is comparable to tiny subcaliber shells. The penetration usually is slightly more than 100 mm. This little penetration is because shell is stabilized in flight by spinning. A lot of stream's energy is dispersed by its centrifugal force. This was an issue until high explosive anti-tank fin stabilized shells were developed. This led to drastic increase in penetration. In-game, heat fin stabilized penetration starts from 200 mm and increase with caliber. Same principle weaponry installed on a bigger rocket can reach 800 mm for some top-tier vehicles. Because of explosions, all these shells can also damage external modules like optics, machine gun and main gun or track if detonation is close enough. There are also smoke rounds. Some of them are shot by smoke launchers and are used mainly defensively, but some will load into your main gun and can be shot at longer distances. This can be used to make someone in sniping position across the map useless for some time, while you can relatively safely cross the open field. But smoke shell will use your gun, making you unable to use anti-tank rounds until next reload, and taking space in your ammo rack, increasing risk of its explosion. What shells do you prefer and why? Tell me in the comments as soon as you subscribe.